Royce Barrett hadn't touched another human being in 3 years. Not a handshake, not a shoulder bump, nothing. So when he found himself carrying a bleeding woman through the canyon with her blood soaking into his shirt, something felt fundamentally wrong about how right it felt. Her weight against his chest, her breath on his neck, the way her fingers gripped his collar like she was holding on to the last solid thing in the world. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from, but she was whispering something in a language he couldn't understand. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he was running faster than he'd run in years. The wolves were gone, but something else was chasing him now. The cabin door slammed behind them, and Royce laid her on the table he used for skinning game. Blood pulled beneath her immediately. Her eyes rolled back, then snapped forward, locking onto his face with an intensity that made him step back. She tried to speak, choked on it, then managed one word in broken English. Help! He should have left her in the canyon. Should have kept writing when he heard the screams. Should have done what he'd done for 3 years. Kept his head down, stayed out of other people's problems, survived alone. But her scream hadn't sounded like just fear. It sounded like rage, like she was fighting something twice her size and refusing to quit. And that sound had cracked something open in him that he thought had sealed shut permanently. Her clothes were shredded, for deep gashes ran across her shoulder and down her arm where claws had torn through flesh. Her leg was worse, puncture wounds from teeth that had locked on and tried to drag her down. The wolves had been starving. He'd seen in their eyes when he'd charged in, rifle raised, heart hammering so hard he thought it might explode. He grabbed clean cloth from the shelf, pressed it against the worst wound on her shoulder. She gasped, body going rigid, but her eyes never left his face. There was something unnerving about her stare. Not gratitude, not fear, something else entirely. "You saved me," she whispered, the words barely audible. He nodded once, focused on stopping the bleeding. His hands moved automatically. Years of stitching up horses and cattle made him steady even when his pulse was chaos. But every time his fingers brushed her skin, something electric shot up his arms. He told himself it was adrenaline. Told himself it was the shock of breaking 3 years of isolation in the most violent way possible. He didn't believe himself. She watched him work, with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through his skull into every locked room he'd built inside himself. Her breathing slowed, steadied, her fingers uncurled from his collar, then reached up and touched his jaw. Just one finger, barely a brush of contact. He froze. "You have kind eyes," she said. Her accent thick, but her meaning crystal clear. But sad eyes. He pulled back, broke the contact, returned to wrapping her wounds. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be read, didn't want whatever this was that was happening between them in the silence of his cabin with her blood on his hands and her warmth seeping into his chest. She let him finish, didn't speak again. But when he finally stepped back, satisfied that she wouldn't bleed out on his table, she pushed herself up on her elbows despite the pain that clearly shot through her entire body. "What's your name?" she asked. "Roy." She repeated it, testing the shape of it in her mouth. Then she smiled. Actually, smiled, despite the agony she must have been in. "I am Ka." The name hung in the air between them. Apache, he knew it instantly. Knew what it meant for her to be this far from tribal lands. Knew what it meant that she'd been alone when the wolves found her. Knew what it would mean if anyone discovered she was here. "You need to leave," he said. But the words came out hollow. Where would she go? She could barely stand. Smila widened just slightly. There was something dangerous in it. Something that made his stomach tighten and his breath catch. "You saved my life," she said slowly, deliberately. "That means something. Where I come from, that means everything. I don't need anything from you." Her eyes flashed. "Maybe not, but I need something from you." He waited, already knowing he wouldn't like whatever came next. Ka leaned forward, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fresh blood seeping through the bandages. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, but every word hit him like a physical blow. Teach me why a man who lives like he's already dead would risk everything to save a stranger. The question landed in his chest and stayed there burning because he didn't have an answer. Didn't know why he'd done it. Didn't know why his hands were still shaking. Didn't know why the thought of her leaving felt worse than the thought of her staying. And from the look in her eyes, she knew it too. The question hung between them, like smoke, thick, impossible to ignore, slowly filling every corner of the cabin, until Royce felt like he was suffocating on it. He turned away from her, busied himself cleaning blood off his hands in the basin by the window. The water turned pink, then red, then dark. I don't owe you explanations, he said, scrubbing harder than necessary. No, Ka's voice came from behind him, steady despite her pain. But you owe yourself one. He gripped the edge of the basin, knuckles white. 3 years of silence, 3 years of carefully maintained distance. And this woman, this stranger bleeding on his table, was peeling him, open with nothing but questions and those unrelenting eyes. You need rest, he said, still not turning around. I'll take the floor. You take the bed. The sound of her moving made him tense. He heard fabric shift, heard her breath catch his pain shot through her wounds, heard her feet touch the floor. She shouldn't be standing, shouldn't be moving at all. But when he finally turned, she was upright, one hand pressed against the table for balance, the other hanging loose at her side. Blood seeped through the bandages on her shoulder. You're making it worse, he said, moving toward her automatically. She raised her free hand, stopping him mid-step. Her palm was small, fingers long and graceful, despite the dirt and blood caked under her nails. I need to see if I can walk, she said simply. If I can't, I'm a burden. If I'm a burden, you'll resent me. If you resent me, I need to leave before that happens. The logic was sound, cold, practical. Everything he'd been trying to tell himself since he'd carried her through his door, but hearing her say it out loud felt like a knife sliding between his ribs. Walk then, he said, harsher than he intended. Kaya took one step. Her leg nearly buckled. She caught herself, jaw clenched so hard he could see the muscles jumping beneath her. Sicking. Sweat beat on her forehead, but she didn't make a sound, didn't ask for help, just took another step then, another until she'd crossed half the cabin. Then her leg gave out completely. Royce caught her before she hit the ground. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulled her against his chest, and for the second time that day he was holding her, but this time she was conscious. This time she was looking right at him. This time her hands were on his shoulders, and her face was inches from his, and he could feel every breath she took like it was his own. I've got you, he said, the words coming out rougher than gravel. I know, she whispered back. Something in the way she said it made his heart slam against his ribs. Not grateful, not relieved, something else, something that felt like recognition. He carried her to the bed in the corner, a simple frame with blankets he'd woven himself during endless winter nights when sleep wouldn't come. Laid her down as carefully as he'd handle newborn FO. Started to pull away. Her hand caught his wrist. Stay, she said, just until I sleep. That's not please. The word cracked something in him. He'd spent 3 years making sure no one could ask him for anything. No one could need him. No one could look at him with eyes that said they trusted him not to break them. But here she was, broken already, trusting him anyway. He sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still around his wrist. Her grip was weak but insistent. Her eyes were already starting to close. Exhaustion and blood loss finally dragging her under. Your wolves, she murmured, half-conscious. Why were they so hungry? He stiffened. Not his wolves. Never his. But he knew what she meant. Knew this territory. Knew the pack that roamed these canyons. Winter was hard, he said quietly. Game's been scarce. She made a small sound that might have been understanding. Her thumb moved against his wrist. Barely a brush of skin on skin, probably unconscious, but it sent electricity straight up his arm. You know what it's like, she whispered, eyes still closed. To be so hungry, you'd risk everything for one moment of warmth. He didn't answer. couldn't answer because she was right. And that terrified him more than the wolves had. Ka's breathing evened out. Her grip on his wrist loosened, but didn't release. He should move, should pull away, should put distance between himself and whatever this was building in his chest like a storm he couldn't outrun. Instead, he stayed, watched her sleep, watched the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, watched the rise and fall of her chest beneath. Bandages soaked with her blood and his guilt. And something else he refused to name. Outside, wind howled through the canyon. Inside, the fire crackled low, and somewhere between the sound of her breathing and the feeling of her pulse against his skin, Royce realized he'd already made a choice he didn't remember making. He was going to let her stay, not because she needed him, but because somewhere in the chaos of saving her life, he'd started needing her to survive. And that realization was more dangerous than any pack of starving wolves could ever be. Dawn came cold and merciless. Ka's hand had fallen away from his wrist. Sometime in the night, Roy stood, every muscle in his back, screaming from hours spent sitting rigid. On the edge of the bed, he needed to check the horses, needed to secure the corral, needed to do something that felt normal. But when he reached the door, her voice stopped him cold. Royce. He turned. She was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him with those eyes that saw too much. They'll come looking for me. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward, touching everything. His safety, her safety, the fragile peace he'd built in this isolated corner of the world. Who? He asked, though he already knew. My people, she said simply. And when they find me here with you, everything changes. Everything changes. The words echoed in the cabin long after Kaya spoke them. Roy stood frozen at the door, his hand still on the handle, his mind racing through scenarios he didn't want to imagine. How long? He asked. She shifted, pain crossing her face as she moved. Maybe 3. I was tracking game for 5 days. Before the wolves found me. They'll backtrack my trail. They're good at it. He turned to face her fully. And when they find you here, her expression darkened. It won't be pleasant for either of us. Royce moved away from the door back toward the bed. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to see the bruise forming along her jaw. Close. Enough to count the shallow cuts on her neck where branches had torn skin during her fight. Why were you alone? He asked. 5 days is a long time to track without a hunting partner. Kaya's eyes flickered with something that looked like shame, then defiance, then resignation. Because I refused the marriage they chose for me. Because I told the elders I would choose my own path. Because I'm stubborn and proud, and I thought proving I could hunt alone would make them respect my choice. And instead, I nearly died proving I was right to want freedom. The irony wasn't lost on him. She'd run from one cage straight into another. His cabin, his care, his world. But there was something in her voice that made his chest ache. He knew that tone. Knew what? It felt like to choose isolation over submission. You could have died for that pride, he said quietly. Yes, she met his eyes without flinching. But I would have died free. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Royce crossed. His arms leaned against the wall, studied her. Blood loss had palled at her skin, but her spine was still straight. Wounds covered her body, but her chin was still raised. She looked like someone who'd been beaten down and refused to stay down. He recognized her because he saw himself. What happens if you go back injured? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then they'll say I was weak. They'll say I proved I need protection. They'll force the marriage to keep me safe from my own foolishness. And if you don't go back, then I'm exiled tribulus, which means I'm prey for anyone who finds me. Royce felt anger rising in his throat. Anger at a system that gave her no real choices. Anger at a world that punished women for wanting something beyond what men decided for them. But beneath the anger was something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. How long before you can ride? He asked. She blinked, surprised by the question. A week? Maybe less if I push through the pain. Don't push, he said firmly. Heal properly. We have time. The word came out soft, questioning. Royce realized what he'd said, realized he just included himself in her future without meaning to. He should take it back, should correct himself, should make it clear this was temporary. Instead, he said, "You need supplies if you're going to survive alone. Food, weapons, a horse. I can provide those, but only if you're strong enough to use them." Kaya stared at him like he'd just offered her the world. Maybe he had. Maybe freedom was the only currency that mattered between them. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Royce pushed off the wall, moved to the window where morning light was starting to filter through. Gaps in the wooden shutters. Outside, his land stretched empty and vast. Inside, his life had become suddenly terrifyingly complicated. "Because I know what it's like to run," he said, not looking at her. "And I know what it's like when no one helps you." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken things. He heard her shift on the bed, heard fabric rustle, heard her breath catch as pain flared. Then he heard her voice, steady and certain. "Royce," he turned. She was looking at him with an intensity that made his pulse jump. Her dark hair fell across her shoulders, tangled and wild. Her wounds were visible beneath torn fabric, but her eyes were clear and sharp and absolutely focused on him. "When they come," she said slowly, "you need to tell them you found me unconscious and injured. Tell them you were going to bring me back as soon as I could ride. Tell them anything that keeps you safe." He frowned. "And you?" "I'll tell them the truth. That you saved my life. That you showed me more respect in 2 days than they showed me in 20 years. She paused, something fierce crossing her face. "That if they punish you for basic human decency, they prove exactly why I wanted to leave. You'll make it worse for yourself. I know, but I won't lie to protect men who would have let me die to prove a point." The conviction in her voice sent something through him like lightning. This wasn't just about freedom. This was about dignity, about refusing to be broken, even when breaking would be easier. He found himself walking back to the bed. Found himself sitting on the edge again. Found himself close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "You're either very brave," he said quietly, "or very foolish." Kasmilet actually smiled, despite everything. "Can I be both?" Something in his chest cracked, open wider. He'd spent 3 years avoiding this exact feeling, this pull toward another person, this dangerous caring that came with consequences he wasn't ready to face. But sitting there watching her smile through pain, watching her choose truth over safety, watching her be exactly the kind of stubborn he understood in his bones, he realized it was already too late. She reached up slowly, giving him time to move away. When he didn't, her fingers touched his jaw, mirroring the gesture from a night before. But this time, she let her hand stay, let her thumb brush across his cheek, let him feel the full weight of her attention. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving me in that canyon." His throat went tight. He should say something, should pull away, should remember all the reasons this couldn't happen. Instead, he turned, his face in her palm, just slightly, just enough to feel her warmth against his skin, just enough to admit what he'd been denying since he'd heard her scream. He'd saved her because something in that sound had woken him from a 3-year sleep. And now that he was awake, he didn't know how to go back. 3 days passed in a rhythm Royce had forgotten existed. Wake before dawn, check her wounds, change bandages, watch her eat the food he prepared, feel her eyes on him while he worked, pretend he didn't notice how his hands shook every time he touched her skin. On the 4th morning, she was standing by the window when he woke. "You should be resting," he said, sitting up from his makeshift bed on the floor. "I've rested enough." Kaya turned to face him, morning light catching in her hair. "The wounds are healing. I can feel my strength coming back." He stood, moved closer to inspect the bandages on her shoulder. She didn't flinch when his fingers pulled back the fabric. The gashes were closing cleanly. No signs of infection. Her body was doing what it needed to survive. This was doing something else entirely. "You're a fast healer," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Apache women are taught to endure." She watched his face while he worked. We learn early that complaining about pain is a luxury we can't afford. His jaw tightened. That's not strength. That's survival. What's the difference? The question caught him off guard. He finished securing the fresh bandage, but didn't step back. They were close enough that he could feel her breath, close enough that the heat from her body reached him despite the morning chill. Strength is choosing to endure, he said quietly. Survival is having no choice. Ka's eyes searched his face. And which one are you? The question cut deeper than he expected. He turned away and moved to the basin to wash his hands, but she followed him slower than before, but determined. Her hand caught his arm before he could retreat further. What happened 3 years ago? She asked softly. His entire body went rigid. That's not. You know everything about why I ran? She interrupted. You know what I'm risking by being here, but I don't know. What made you build this cage around yourself? It's not a cage, isn't it? She moved around to face him, forcing him to meet her eyes. You live alone. You touch no one. You've built your life in the most isolated place you could. Fine. That's not freedom, Royce. That's hiding. The words landed like blows. He wanted to be angry, wanted to push her away, wanted to rebuild the wall she was tearing down with nothing but her presence and her relentless honesty. Instead, he heard himself speaking. I had a family, he said, the words coming out rough and broken. Wife, daughter. We lived in a settlement 2 days' ride from here. I was working when raiders came through. By the time I got back, they were already gone. The people I loved. Most in this world died calling for me, and I wasn't there. The silence that followed felt like drowning. He never said those words out loud. Never let anyone close enough to ask. But Ka was looking at him with such raw understanding that he couldn't stop. I tracked them for 3 months, he continued. Found them eventually. Did what I needed to do. Came here, built this cabin, decided that if I couldn't protect the people I loved, I wouldn't love anyone. Again, his voice cracked on the last word. He hated it. Hated showing weakness. Hated that she'd open him up so easily. But then Ka did something he didn't expect. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Not gentle, not careful, just held him with a fierce certainty that said she wasn't afraid of his pain or his past or the darkness he carried. You don't have to carry it alone, she whispered against his chest. Something inside him shattered. His arms came up, pulled her closer, held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Her warmth soaked into him. Her heartbeat matched his, and for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't drowning anymore. They stood like that, wrapped together in the morning light, until Ka pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her hand came up to his face, traced the scar above his eyebrow. He'd gotten in a fight he barely remembered. You saved my life, she said, but maybe I'm supposed to save yours too. Before he could respond, before he could think about all the reasons this was impossible, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't soft, wasn't tentative. It was desperate and hungry and full of everything they'd been. Try not to say. His hand tangled in her hair. Her fingers gripped his shirt. The world narrowed to just this. Her mouth on his, her body pressed against him. Her breath mixing with his breath, until he couldn't tell where he ended. And she began. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, her forehead rested against his. Neither of them spoke. Words would have ruined what just passed between them. But the moment couldn't last. Outside, a sound cut through the morning. Distant but distinct. Horse hooves, multiple riders. Moving fast. Kaya went still in his arms. They're here. Royce's mind snapped. Back to reality. How many? She closed her eyes, listened. 4, maybe 5. He released her, moved to the window, peered through a gap in the shutters. In the distance, dust rose from the canyon. Trail. They had minutes, maybe less. What do we do? She asked. But there was no fear in her voice, only calculation. Royce turned to face her. Saw the woman who'd refused an arranged marriage, who'd hunted alone for 5 days, who'd fought wolves and survived. Saw the woman who just kissed him like she meant it. Saw the choice he hadn't known he'd been waiting 3 years to make. We tell them the truth, he said. Most of it anyway. And the rest. He moved back to her, cupped her face in his hands. The rest is ours. Her eyes flashed with something that looked like triumph. Then we'd better make our story match. Outside, the riders drew closer. Inside, Royce Barrett felt truly alive for the first time since he'd buried his family in the ground. And the woman standing in his cabin, blood still staining her bandages, fire burning in her eyes, was the reason why. The question wasn't whether he'd fight for her. The question was whether he'd survive what came next. The riders came in hard, horses kicking up dust that turned the morning air thick and brown. Royce stood in his doorway, rifle in hand, but pointed down. Not threatening, not welcoming, just present. Custode. Behind him, visible through the open door, her posture straight despite the bandages showing beneath her torn clothing. She'd insisted on standing, insisted on facing them on her feet rather than weak in his bed. 5 men, dismounted, for were young, muscular, their faces painted with suspicion and anger. But the 5th man was older. His hair streaked with gray, his movements deliberate and controlled. He carried authority like a weapon. The Ellers. Eyes went immediately to Ka, scanned her injuries, then shifted to Royce with an intensity that could have cut stone. "You are the man who has my daughter," he said in heavily accented English. Daughter. The word hit Royce in the chest. He'd known she was important, but the leader's daughter changed everything. "I'm the man who kept your daughter alive," Royce replied. Keeping his voice level, the elder moved closer, his warriors fanning out behind him. "By taking her into your home, by touching her, by keeping her from her people, he found me dying." Ka's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The wolves had torn me open. I was bleeding out in the canyon. He saved me when no one else was there. You should not have been alone." The Eller's voice hardened, speaking now, in their language. But Royce understood the tone, even without the words. Blame, disappointment, control. One of the younger warriors stepped forward, his hand on the knife at his belt. "She is promised to me. You have dishonored that promise." Ka's laugh was sharp and bitter. "I dishonored nothing. I refused. You before I left. I refuse you still." The warrior's face darkened. "You have no right. I have every right." She snapped back, switching to English so Royce could follow. "This is my life, my body, my choice, and I choose to make my own path." The elder raised his hand, silencing the younger man. Then he turned his full attention to Royce. "You will be compensated for your assistance. You will accept payment and forget you ever saw her." It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in courtesy. Royce felt Ka tense behind him, felt the weight of what came next pressing down on both of them. He could take the payment, could let them ride away with her, could return to his safe, isolated existence where no one could hurt him, because no one could reach him. But when he looked at the elder, he didn't see authority. He saw the same system that had tried to cage Ka, the same thinking that said women were property, that choices could be made for others, that freedom was something to be granted rather than claimed. He thought about his wife, about how she'd laughed about, how she'd chosen him freely and fiercely, about how that choice had been the best thing in his life until it was ripped away. And he realized that letting Ka be taken back to a life she didn't want would be its own kind of death. "She stays," Royce said quietly. The clearing went silent. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. The elder's eyes narrowed. "You do not understand what you are saying." "I understand perfectly." Royce shifted his weight, didn't raise the rifle, but didn't set it down either. "She's healing. When she's ready, she'll make her own choice about where she goes. But I won't hand her over like she's a lost horse being returned to a stable." The warrior who'd been promised to Kaya lunged forward. "You dare?" The Ellers, hand shot out, grabbed the younger man's arm, stopped him cold. His eyes never left Royce's face. "You would fight for her, if necessary. Why? You owe her nothing. You owe us nothing." Royce felt Kaya's hand press against his back, felt her standing with him, not behind him, felt the truth he'd been avoiding since. He'd heard her scream echo through the canyon. "Because some things are worth fighting for," he said, "and she's one of them." The elder studied him for a long moment. Then he looked past Royce to his daughter. Ka, is this what you want? She moved to stand beside Royce, her shoulder brushing his. Yes. You understand what this means? You will not be welcome in our camp. You will be separated from your people. I understand. Her voice was steady. I choose separation over submission. The elder's face showed nothing, but something shifted in his eyes. Pain, maybe your respect, or both. Then you have made your choice, he said, and you will bear the consequences. He turned to leave, but the warrior Ka had refused wasn't finished. His hand went to his. Knife pulled it free. If I cannot have her, no one will. He moved fast, but Royce was faster. The rifle came up, hammer-cocking in one smooth motion. The sound stopped the warrior mid-stride. Don't, Royce said softly. Walk away. 4. A heartbeat. The world balanced on the edge of violence. Then the elder spoke sharply in their language. The warrior's jaw clenched, but he sheathed his knife. This is not over, the warrior said in broken English, his eyes burning into Royce. Yes, Kaya said, her voice cold. And final. It is. The warriors mounted their horses. The elder paused, looked back at his daughter one last time. There was something in his expression that looked like goodbye. Then they rode away, dust swallowing them until they were just shapes in the distance. Royce lowered the rifle, felt the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving his hands shaking. He'd just made an enemy of an entire tribe, had just put himself between a woman and her people, had just thrown away every bit of safety he'd carefully constructed, and he didn't regret a single second of it. Ka turned to him, her face unreadable. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said. I did. Why? She was standing so close he could see gold flecks in her dark eyes. Could see the question beneath the question. Could see that what she was really asking was whether this was real or if he just made a tactical choice in the heat of the moment. Royce reached up, cooped her face in his hand. Because when you kissed me, he said quietly, I stopped being the man who wanted to be alone. And I don't know how to go back. Ka's breath caught. Her hand covered. His held it against her cheek. Then don't go back. Something in her voice made his heart slam against his ribs. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a hope. It was a claim, a declaration, a line drawn in the dust that separated before from after. And standing there with the dust of her tribe still hanging in the air, with danger sitting on the horizon like a storm, with everything in his life suddenly complicated and uncertain, Royce realized he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 2 weeks passed like water through fingers, fast and impossible to hold. Ka's wounds healed into pale scars that would fade with time. Her strength returned in increments, each day bringing her closer to the woman who'd hunted alone and refused to bow. But something else was happening between them that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with the way she looked at him across the cabin, the way his hands lingered when he helped her stand, the way silence between them felt heavier than words. Royce taught her to handle his rifle, showed her how to aim, how to breathe, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger, standing behind her, his chest against her back, his arms guiding hers. He felt every breath she took like it was his own. You're a natural, he said after she hit 3 targets in a row. I had good teachers. She turned, her head, their faces inches apart, but none of them ever stood this close. His heart hammered. He should step back, should put distance between them, should remember that proximity bred complications he wasn't sure he could handle. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was. At night, they sat by the fire, and she told him stories about her childhood, about learning to track deer with her grandfather, about refusing to wear the traditional dresses her mother made, about the first time she'd taken down game alone and felt truly free. He listened like her words were water and he'd been dying of thirst. Sometimes she asked him questions about his daughter, about his wife, about the life he'd lost. And slowly, painfully, he let her see the man he'd been before grief turned him into stone. On the 14th night, she woke screaming. Royce was across the cabin in seconds, kneeling beside her bed, hands on her shoulders. It's just a dream. You're safe. Her eyes were wild, unfocused. The wolves, they were. I know. He pulled her against his chest, felt her trembling. They're gone. I promise. She clung to him, fingers digging into his shirt, her breath coming in ragged gasps against his neck. But gradually her breathing slowed, her grip loosened, and when she finally pulled back enough to look at him, something had shifted in her expression. Stay with me tonight, she whispered. Just sleep beside me. I don't want to be alone. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, that sharing a bed, even innocently, would cross a line he couldn't uncross. But looking at her face, seeing vulnerability she rarely showed, he couldn't refuse. He lay down, beside her on top of the blankets, maintaining separation. She turned onto her side, facing him, in the dim light. From the dying fire, her features were soft, unguarded. Thank you, she said, quietly for everything. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. She reached out, traced the scar above his eyebrow again, the gesture becoming familiar between them. You gave me something I never had. Choice. He caught her hand, held it against his face. You gave me something too. What? A reason to stop hiding. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Her thumb brushed his cheekbone. His pulse jumped. The space between them felt electric, charged with everything they hadn't said, everything they'd been carefully not doing for 2 weeks. Roy, she whispered, and the way she said his name made something in his chest crack, wide open. He closed the distance between them, kissed her with everything he'd been holding back. Her arms came around his neck, pulled him closer. The blankets between them became meaningless as their bodies pressed together, as her mouth opened beneath his. As 3 years of loneliness and 2 weeks of denial burned away in the heat of wanting something real. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, her forehead rested against his. Her eyes were dark and intense and absolutely certain. You're mine now, she said, the words, somewhere between declaration and question. If you want to be. The phrase landed in his chest and stayed there. Not a claim of ownership, not a demand, but a truth she was offering him. The chance to belong to someone again, to be chosen, to matter to another human being in a way that made isolation impossible. He thought about his wife, about the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day, about the love he'd lost and sworn he'd never risk again. And he realized that grief had taught him the wrong lesson. The lesson wasn't to never love again. It was that love, even when it ended in loss, was worth every moment of the risk. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I want to be yours. Something fierce and triumphant flashed in her eyes. Then I'm yours, too. No taking it back. No taking it back, he agreed. She kissed him again, softer, this time sealing the promise between them. Then she settled against his chest, his arms wrapped around her breath evening out as sleep found her again. But Roy stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heartbeat against his ribs. He just promised himself to a woman who'd been exiled from her people, who had enemies that wanted her back or dead, who had chosen freedom over safety at every turn. And he'd do it again without hesitation. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying sound from the canyon. In the distance, coyotes called to each other. Closer, something moved through the brush near the corral, rustling branches, and disturbing his horses. Royce tensed, listening harder. Could be deer. Could be nothing, but something in his gut said otherwise. He carefully extracted himself from Kaya's embrace, grabbed his rifle, moved silently to the window. The moon was high, casting silver light across the clearing. His horses shifted nervously in their pen, and at the edge of the tree-in, barely visible, a figure watched the cabin. The warrior who'd been promised to Kaya stood perfectly still, his face painted with shadows and malice. He didn't move, didn't approach, just watched. It was a message, a promise, a declaration that the confrontation 2 weeks ago hadn't ended anything. It had only postponed the inevitable. Royce's grip tightened on the rifle. He could shoot from here, could end the threat before it escalated. But killing a man in cold blood, even an enemy, wasn't something he could do without becoming someone he didn't want to be. So instead, he made sure the warrior saw him, made sure the man understood that Kaya wasn't unprotected, that claiming her would cost more than he might be willing to pay. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the clearing. Then the warrior melted back into the darkness, gone as silently as he'd appeared. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. And when it came to a head, blood would be spilled. Royce returned to the bed, slid back beside Ka. She stirred, reached for him in her sleep, and he pulled her close. Protected her even in dreams. Tomorrow he'd tell her what he'd seen. Tomorrow, they'd prepare for what was coming. Tonight, he'd just hold her and pretend the world outside his cabin didn't exist. Morning came with frost on, the windows and tension in Royce's shoulders that wouldn't ease. He'd barely slept, listening for sounds that never came, watching shadows that never moved. Kaya woke to find him already, dressed, rifle cleaned and loaded, his face hard in a way she hadn't seen since the day her tribe arrived. What happened? She asked, sitting up. He was here last night. The warrior watching the cabin. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, not surprise. She'd known this would come eventually. What did he do? Nothing. Just watched. Royce moved to the window, scanned the tree in. But that's worse than an attack. It means he's planning something. Ka stood moved to stand beside him. Her hand found his arm. He won't stop until he gets what he wants, which is me dead or returned to the tribe. Either proves his point. She looked up at him. But I won't let him have either. Royce turned to face her. Fully. This isn't your fight alone anymore. I know. That's what scares me. She touched his face, the gesture tender. Despite the tension in the air, I can accept consequences for my choices, but I can't accept you paying for them. Too late, he said simply. I made my choice the moment I pulled you off that table and decided you mattered. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning. But this time, it wasn't 5 riders. It was 3, and they weren't stopping at the edge of the clearing. They rode straight to the cabin dismounted before there. Horses fully stopped. The warrior from 2 weeks ago was in the lead, flanked by 2 others. Their faces were painted. Their weapons were drawn. Royce grabbed his rifle, positioned himself in the doorway. Kaya stood behind him, but not cowering. Never cowering. Come and talk. Royce called out, keeping his tone neutral despite his racing heart. The warrior spat in the dirt. Talk is finished. You were given a chance to return what you stole. I stole nothing. She's not property. She was promised to me. The warrior's voice shook with barely contained rage. You dishonored that promise. You dishonored me. Now you pay. One of the other warriors stepped forward, his bow drawn. The elder said, we could handle this ourselves. Said if we brought proof of justice, he would accept it. Justice? Ka's voice cut through like a blade. This isn't about justice. This is about pride. You have no voice here, woman. The warrior snarled. Wrong. Kaya moved to stand. Beside Royce, her chin raised. I have every right to speak about my own life. And I'm telling you now, I will never be yours. Not by force, not by tradition, not by any claim you think you have. Then you choose death. The words hung in the air. Final and absolute. Royce's finger moved to the trigger. 3 against 2, but he had the high ground and better cover. Still, someone would die today. Maybe everyone. Wait, a voice called from the tree in. All eyes turned. Ka's father, the tribal elder, emerged on horseback, alone. His face was unreadable as he took in the scene. His daughter, standing with the outsider, warriors with weapons drawn, violence seconds away. This ends now, the elder said, his voice carrying absolute authority. Father, Kaya started. He raised his hand, silencing her. Then he looked at the warrior. You had your chance to challenge this man honorably. Instead, you come tonight like a thief. This is not our way. He dishonored. No, the elder's voice went cold. She refused you before she left. You refused to accept her choice. That dishonor is yours, not hers. The warrior's face twisted with rage. You would side with them. I side with Truth. The elder dismounted, moved to stand between the warriors and the cabin. My daughter made her choice. She has lived with the consequences. Now you must live with yours. I will not accept. You will accept, or you will be cast out, as she was. The elder's eyes were hard as stone. Our people do not force women into bonds they refuse. That is the law. Honor it or leave. The tension stretched so tight it felt like the air itself might shatter. The warrior's hand shook on his knife. His companions watched him, waiting for his decision. Finally, with visible effort, the warrior sheathed his weapon. But his eyes, when they found Ka, were full of poison. This is not finished, he said. Yes, Kaya replied, her voice steady. It is. The warriors mounted their horses, rode away without another word. But the threat hung in the air long after they disappeared. The elder turned to his daughter, looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. A gesture that might have been approval, or might have been goodbye, or might have been both. You have chosen a hard path, he said. Quietly. I chose my path. That's enough. He looked at Royce next, measured him with eyes that had seen decades of men, of choices, of consequences. You understand what you've taken on? I understand that she's worth it. Something almost like a smile touched the elder's face. Then perhaps you will survive what comes. He mounted his horse, but before he left, he spoke once more. There are others who will not accept the council's ruling. Men who see this as weakness. You should leave this place. Go somewhere they cannot find you. Ka's hand found Royce's. Well, consider it. The elder nodded, then rode away, leaving them alone in the clearing. Royce felt Ka's fingers tighten around his. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had just happened. Her father had defended her right to choose. But in doing so, he'd also made clear that protection came with an expiration date. We should listen to him, Caius said. Quietly. About leaving, Royce pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her. This is my home. These are my lands. I've run before. I won't run again. Even if staying means fighting, he thought about his family, about how he'd been away when they needed him most. About 3 years of isolation built on regret. About the woman in his arms who'd given him a reason to stop just surviving and start living, especially if it means fighting, he said, because now I have something worth fighting for. Kaya pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. Then we fight. Together. Together, he agreed. But even as he said it, even as he held her, Royce's eyes scanned the tree. The warrior had left. But men fueled by rage and humiliation didn't give up easily. They waited. They planned. They struck when defenses were lowest. And somewhere out there in the canyon shadows, Royce knew their enemy was doing exactly that. The question wasn't if he would come back. The question was when and whether. Royce would be ready when he did. 3 nights later, the attack came. Royce woke to the smell of smoke. Not the comfortable smoke of a dying fire, but the sharp, acrid smell of burning wood and oil. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, already knowing what he'd find before he reached the window. The corral was on fire. His horses screamed, panicked and trapped, and standing at the edge of the firelight, visible and deliberate. The warrior watched with satisfaction carved into his face. 2 others flanked him, their expressions eager for violence. They wanted him outside, wanted him to choose between saving his horses and defending his home, wanted him divided and vulnerable. But Royce had spent 2 weeks preparing for this exact moment. Kai said, sharply, and she was already moving. She grabbed the second rifle he'd prepared, positioned herself at the back window, while he covered the front. They'd practiced this, planned for it, knew exactly what came next. The horses, she said, pain in her voice. I know. His jaw clenched. But if we go out, they'll kill us both. The horses or our lives. That's the choice they're giving us. Then we give him a different choice. Before he could ask what she meant, Ka fired, not at the men, but at the corral gate's locking mechanism. The wood splintered. The gate swung open. His horses, wild with fear, stampeded out directly toward the three warriors. Chaos erupted. The men scattered, shouting, trying to avoid being trampled. One went down, caught on her hooves. The warrior dove behind a tree. And in that moment of confusion, Royce and Ka moved. They came out opposite sides of the cabin, rifles raised, positioning themselves so the warriors were caught between them. The firelight turned everything into sharp contrasts of light and shadow. Smoke made eyes water, but Royce's aim was steady. "It's over," he called out. "Leave now, or don't leave at all." The warrior emerged. From behind a tree, knife drawn, rage making him reckless. "You think you've won? You think you can keep her?" "I don't keep her," Royce said. "She stays because she chooses to. Then she chooses death." The warrior lunged, but not at Royce. At Ka, moving fast, using the smoke as cover, closing the distance. Before she could aim. But Ka didn't need to aim. She'd been hunting since she was a child, tracking animals that moved. Faster and more unpredictably than any man. She sidestepped, swung the rifle. But connected with his jaw with a crack that echoed across the clearing. The warrior went down hard, his knife skittered away, and when he looked up, both rifles were pointed at his face. The other two warriors had fled, leaving their companion alone and defeated in the dirt. "You lost," Ka said, her voice cold and final. "Not because he's stronger than you. Not because I chose him over you. You lost because you never understood that I was never yours to win." The warrior's face twisted with humiliation and rage. But beneath it, Roy saw something else. Recognition. The understanding that this truly was over. "Go," Roy said, "and don't come back." For a moment, it looked like the warrior might refuse, might choose death over the shame of retreat. But survival instinct won out. He dragged himself to his feet, stumbled toward the tree and disappeared into darkness. The fire still burned, but the corral was mostly intact. His horses had scattered, but would return by morning. And standing beside him, rifle still ready, was the woman who'd fought alongside him like they'd been doing it for years instead of minutes. Royce lowered his weapon, looked at her, really looked at her. Ka stood in the firelight, her hair wild, her face smudged with smoke, her eyes fierce and alive. She'd faced down the man who'd tried to claim her, had defended herself and him without hesitation, had proven that freedom wasn't just something she wanted. It was something she could fight for and win. She lowered her rifle, turned to him, smiled despite everything. "That was your plan? Risk the horses. Best bad option we had." She laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the aftermath of violence. And she moved to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, kissed him hard. Relief and adrenaline and triumph all mixed together in that kiss. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "You know they might come back. Let them," she said. "We'll be ready." And looking at her, Royce believed it. Believed they could face whatever came. Believed that together was stronger than alone. Believed that the 3 years he'd spent hiding from life had been necessary to lead him. Exactly here, to this moment, to this woman who'd saved him by letting him save her. 6 months later, they were still there. The cabin had grown, a second room added, space for the life they were building together. His horses had returned, joined by 2 more Ka had trained herself. The garden she'd planted behind the cabin grew wild and abundant, and every morning Royce woke up with her beside him and remembered what it felt like to be alive. They heard rumors occasionally. Traders passing through mentioned that the warrior had left the territory, that Ka's father had formally recognized her choice, that the tribe no longer spoke her name with shame, but with a grudging respect. But those were distant concerns. Their world had become this cabin, these lands, the life they'd chosen to build where no one could tell them who to be or how to love. One evening, sitting by the fire they'd built together, Ka leaned against his shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your isolation?" Royce looked at her. This woman who'd crashed into his life, covered in blood and refusing to break, who'd chosen him as fiercely as he'd chosen her, who turned his carefully maintained loneliness into something that felt like home. Every day, he said. She pulled back, surprised, and saw his smile. I regret every day I wasted alone, he continued, pulling her close. When I could have been looking for you, Kyle laughed, kissed him softly. You found me anyway. No, he said. You found me, and you refused to let me stay lost. The fire crackled. The night settled around them, and in the quiet of their cabin, in a life they'd fought for and won, Royce Barrett finally understood what he'd been missing for 3 years. Not safety, not peace, not isolation, just someone worth coming home to. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the Untamed West, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider Super Chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.